Great. So again, pleasure today to introduce Radhika Dutt, who is, I would say, a Renaissance woman. You do a little bit of everything, and you do it also wonderfully. So we're excited to host Radhika Dutt today, who's going to be talking about interviewing like a pro, because she has a great deal of experience interviewing on both sides of the table and really understands what many interviewers in high-profile career positions are looking for. So while she is going to be talking today about her journey from school to career and talking specifically about the different kind of aspects of your own life that you can pull out to interview like a pro, many of her interview insights are going to be useful for people of all ages. So I know it's going to be a riveting talk, and I'm excited to hear it. Take it away, Radhika.
Thanks, Ethel. So, most interviewing advice that I've seen is about how do you answer interviewing questions. There are these very typical questions, such as what are your strengths and weaknesses, and how do you talk about yourself, etc. But a lot of the common advice that is available on interviewing, you can just Google it. So I'm going to skip kind of a lot of the common things that you've heard and focus on something that I wish I'd heard much earlier, something that I've just had to figure out on my own. And that's the fact that, minorities, women, etc. I think when we're interviewing, we really underestimate our story. We underestimate the experience that we have and kind of understate it. So that's really what I want to address today, which is, before we can interview like a pro, we really have to acknowledge our own story. How do we acknowledge that and tell our story without understating it? So I'll give you a quick background about myself. I graduated back in 2000 from MIT. I did my undergrad and grad in electrical engineering there. I've since started companies, I've sold companies, so I've been part of 4 acquisitions, and 2 of those were companies that I'd started. And at the moment, I'm working on a book about product thinking. I live in Boston, and I'm currently in Singapore. So that's the short version about myself, right? Typically, when people are getting to know me, they, detect that, oh, I have an unusual accent. They can't quite place it. And so usually people start with the question, so where are you from? And the answer to that is never simple. It always is this complex answer that, well, I'm from India originally, but then I moved to South Africa, and now US is home. And typically I get this next question, which is, oh, South Africa, that's really interesting. What was it like living in South Africa? And my answer is always this, the statement of facts. There were interesting times for South Africa, really formative moments, and there were formative moments for me. And I stick to the facts in answering this question about, what was it like living in South Africa. I moved in 1991, and I was 12 then. I moved from India. And just to give you some historical context, apartheid laws, meaning segregation laws in South Africa, ended in 1990. So the society definitely was still very segregated. This is actually the school where I went. This was the first school that I went to. And I was the first non-Black kid in my class. And you can see some of the buildings in the background. I think the facilities in the school, they're very rudimentary, let's say. And about 3/4 of the year through, we changed schools. We changed location as well. We went to a white area and we moved to a white school. And I was the first non-white in my class and the second in my school. But so far, I've stuck to facts in terms of kind of just what living in South Africa or what moving in South Africa was like. And I usually stop there because the reality is, talking more about this, it's like, well, where do you start? There's just so much context needed to really understand what South Africa was like at that time. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So we moved in 1991. It was just, with our 2 carry-on luggages each. We didn't, relocate our whole house, furniture, etc. So it was just, kind of our bags of clothes and stuff. And so when we moved there, it really felt like we were starting from scratch. We were starting from scratch. Also because the Indian rupee was not very strong compared to the South African rand. So everything just felt really expensive. And so, from this rather, well-off lifestyle that we had in India, going to South Africa and starting from scratch, that was really difficult to begin with. And when I went to the black school there, what I saw was, I realized this kind of privilege that I had, right? Which is that even though I felt like we didn't have very much, my friends around me, just because of the color of my skin, they felt like, they felt like I was rich. And it was really strange to me. But then, I realized that, well, my parents, my mom is a doctor, my dad's an engineer. I mean, I knew we were going to build up our wealth again over time, right? Even if we were starting from scratch. But for them, they didn't really have that earning potential. The school where we were hardly learning anything. Teachers were very often absent. And even when teachers were in class, they were often chatting with the students there. And, we really weren't learning much. And the students were quite demotivated too as a result. And in fact, a lot of girls in the class dropped out of school because they had gotten pregnant. There was one really formative moment there where, I realized my privilege in that school. One day, we were all in class, and the class was super noisy. And so when the teacher came in, he decided to punish the whole class. And at the time, corporal punishment, I don't know about now, but corporal punishment in the school, and in black schools in general, at least at the time, was very common. And so the teacher decided to punish the whole class, but he spared me. So he caned the whole class, and I didn't get caned. And there was already this resentment by other students who felt like I was privileged because I was smart and was good at school. And so this really highlighted the inequality and the privilege that I didn't get caned. And so the next day, I was caned for no reason, but that was really because of it was to create the sense of equality. Right? And it's this really strange conflict where you're almost like, wow, maybe it was right, maybe it wasn't. Like, it's very confusing. But so that was my experience in this black school. And then 3/4 of the way through, we moved to a white school. And all of a sudden, that privilege changed. This was, you can kind of see the school behind the trees. That's where the school was. So I was the first non-white in the class and the second non-white in the whole school of about 1,000 kids. And, there was no corporal punishment in white school, but it was painful for very different reasons. One of the reasons was that the kids around me, just racism was kind of ingrained in just the culture. The kids there were very few actually malicious kids. Most of them were trying to be nice, actually. But the interesting thing is, in trying to be nice, their idea was to teach me how to do the right things and to show me the right way. It was incredibly patronizing, and I didn't even have the vocabulary to explain kind of why I was so annoyed and mad at them. So it was very hard to make friends. And I also had to prove to the school that that I was worthy of staying in that grade. Otherwise, they were going to set me back by 1 year. And so to prove that I was good enough to stay in that grade, I had to do really well in the final exams, even though I had missed out on 3/4 of the year. And so it was this incredible, pressure. What's interesting about this kind of an experience is how much this racism sort of really gets ingrained in you as well. I'll give you an example where, I'd made a new friend in the neighborhood, where I had invited her over to have a snack after we were playing outside. And so, she comes over and we were chatting, and she says to me, I've never been to a person's house who's not white. And they say all kinds of things about you guys, but you're not bad at all. There's nothing wrong with you. And now, like, most of us would look at that and say, oh my goodness, when I told my kids that this was something that a friend said to me, they were appalled. They're like, oh my gosh, how could someone say that? And what's actually more telling is that I wasn't even offended. I didn't think that was what she said was so appalling, because she was actually one of the nicer kids. She was professing her ignorance and, saying something sort of nice, right? So this was kind of how we grew up. And South Africa was always this mix of, your race mattered most of the time, and then there were times when it didn't matter. So it created this confusion in you. So for instance, where it didn't matter was in math. I had the most amazing teacher where she saw that I needed to be challenged in math, and she offered me and a small cohort of our class a more advanced math. And so she took time out of her personal life. I mean, she took time after school to teach us this advanced math and calculus in our final year of high school. And she was also the person who wrote the recommendation letters for me when I went to MIT. And, and this was another telling experience. When I applied to MIT, I actually got in. And so I was very happy to tell some of my male, peers in that class, for instance, that I had gotten into MIT. And, what's interesting is when I shared this with a few different male peers, 4 of them on separate occasions said to me different versions of, how did you get in? And again, it's more telling that I wasn't even offended. I just kind of laughed it off, right? So going to MIT was the most transformational experience. On my first day after landing there were 80 students who were all international. We were part of the international orientation. And for the first time in a long time, the color of my skin didn't matter one bit. It was just beautiful. But, some of those things that I'd learned in South Africa sort of really were ingrained in me, in that I kind of still question, well, did I really belong there? Because, all of these people around me had amazing resumes. They'd won all sorts of prestigious awards. They were champions in the math Olympiads in their country, some in the world, etc. I hadn't even heard about the Olympiads until I actually arrived at MIT. And and all I could see was what I didn't have in my resume. I really couldn't even recognize what I did have. So for example, I spoke 8 languages, but I just dismissed that's really something that was easy. It just kind of came to me. And that's the lesson that I found. I think as women, minorities, it's really easy to just not really appreciate our own story and only see what we're missing in our resumes. And the story, and by the way, it gets much worse with social media, because we see everyone else's success and we feel all the more that everyone has achieved things that we have not, right? And I want to tell you this story of the pink peppercorns versus the fridge. So my husband, he went to public school. And then in this public school, it really wasn't in your favor to be rich, right? At the school, what really counted was your hard work and just how good you were at school. His brother, on the other hand, went to a private school where it was all about the who you went to school with. It was all the celebrity and rich kids in town who went to that particular private school. As a result, his brother always grew up seeing, high school kids coming to school, driving their own BMWs, for instance. And what he always saw was what he didn't have. It was these novelties that he didn't have. And so when this really became apparent to me was when we were all cooking together. And, his brother wanted to make this perfect dessert. And for that, he needed pink peppercorns. And so we spent a whole day almost going around town trying to find these pink peppercorns. And actually, we eventually found it. He made the dessert, and the dessert was okay, but I didn't even really notice the pink peppercorns. And my husband, on the other hand, he just sort of opened up the fridge, looked in there, saw what's there. He just grabbed a few things, and he cooked up really a very nice and interesting dish, just digging out what's in the fridge. For us, the pink peppercorns are those hard to find or very constructed experiences. If you're writing your college applications, those pink peppercorns are, research internships or building homes in Costa Rica. If you're applying for a job, it's that perfect experience and title that you need or that you feel you need. And what's in your fridge are experiences that you've kind of discounted. Maybe you were working in your family restaurant. Maybe you really were contributing to raising your sibling. You had unique circumstances, and we kind of just don't look at what we had in the fridge that we can make something really interesting with. We feel like we need to seek out these pink peppercorns. But, pink peppercorns, they're really not the main ingredient, right? Our society is in this rat race where achievements are emphasized above character. But in reality, we're not defined by our achievements, but really by what we've overcome or helped others overcome. But finding that narrative for us is hard. Whether we're trying to collect our experiences from our previous jobs or talk about our experiences when we're applying to college, whatever your scenario is, finding that narrative is hard. Because our experiences are messy, our fridge looks like this very often, right? How do you even start to dig in this and sort through it? How do you know kind of what you have on hand? And this is why we end up underestimating our experiences. For me, I didn't even feel like my story was really worthy of sharing. And even in my MIT application essay, there was very little of this I actually shared. And the reason is that, in the story, there are really no villains. It's not a narrative of good overcoming evil that you would want to see. Most of these, it just happened to be kind of the environment that those people had grown up in. They weren't trying to be malicious. To me, my story felt completely ordinary. That, it wasn't to my credit that I ended up in South Africa in those really formative times. So what was there to tell? Because, potentially anyone else could have maybe looked or grown from it in the same way. I hadn't even really acknowledged how these experiences had grown me. And, on top of all of this, I knew that other people had a much tougher life. When I was in that black school, there were so many other people who I knew who were in a much harder situation. So how can I talk about these scenarios and really take credit for something like this? That's what it felt like. And lastly, it was also because, even in putting together this presentation, a lot of those experiences are not easy for me to talk about. And you would rather talk about your achievements than some of these hardships that you've had to endure. And so we always try to find these next set of achievements, which we should, but we should also inventory our fridge, right? So What's in your fridge? How do you go about taking this inventory? One suggestion I have is for every year in your life, start to list memories, events, things that you did. And what we're tempted to do is to leave out the memories that are especially difficult to talk about, right? And that's what I had to do, like really take inventory of my experiences, even to be able to create this presentation. And this is true, whether you're interviewing for a job or, you're writing college applications. I think if you start with the earlier part of your life, it really helps you reveal to yourself some of your motivations and your own drivers. It helps you understand yourself better. So I encourage you to do this for years as far back as you can actually remember. What are some of those memories that really stand out to you in every year of your life? The second step is, organizing your fridge. How do these events actually shape you? What were your feelings? For me, again, my organizing the fridge, I'm very tempted to just share what the facts were as opposed to how that affected me back then and how it continues to affect me today. What did you actually learn from this? How did it end up building character? And one other tip is when you're answering these questions, you really have to avoid cliches. For instance, you want to avoid words like, oh, this sort of an experience, it really made me want to help other people. That's just so broad, you really want to explain kind of how exactly help people, how, in what way, and what exactly made you help, what sort of people, you can't just say help people in general. There's some sort of people that it made you connect with, that it makes you want to help, right? So for me, the result of these formative experiences were that, one, being in that Black school where we weren't really learning very much made me feel for the first time that I really want to learn, that it's not just that, being in India and being in a good socioeconomic place, school was something you obviously did, right? And this was the first time where I saw that not everyone could get an education, even when they were going to school. It made me realize how much I really want to learn. It was also what really fueled my ambition. It was something where I decided that I really wasn't going to fit into the stereotype that people had prepared for me because of the color of my skin. And speaking of, not wanting to fit into into a stereotype, I realized over time that that's also kind of what shaped my accent, by the way. It's not an Indian accent. It's not South African exactly. It's not American really either. Again, it doesn't fit into a stereotype. And it's partly fueled by that, I think, when I dig deep. It also fueled my grit. I had to constantly, prove myself. And that was what I was used to doing. And it's something that even to this day fuels a lot of my drive in my career. And lastly, in terms of being a boss, it makes me really care deeply about equality because that was something that I'd experienced, both experiencing privilege and then lack thereof within the same year. And the last step is pick your ingredients to make your dish. So you've inventoried your fridge. You've figured out, what are your ingredients? What has really shaped you? Now pick your stories that show your character. And this is where I think, you have to recognize that the story you have might look very different from what you typically see, on social media, right? And that's a good thing. You may not even feel like the story, again, is worth sharing or that it has any merit. And so try sharing it with mentors, advisors, and get feedback on it. When you write out your story and share it with others, a lot of their reactions will also help you understand, what you're underestimating and undervaluing, really. So you can apply this approach of, organizing the fridge really to any interview. from college interviews to job interviews. The reality is, whenever you're applying for a new job or college admissions, someone has to take a chance on you. You may not have the perfect experience. In fact, anytime you're applying for a job where it's a step up, and you should be applying for a step up, right? You may very often find that your experience doesn't already have that title that you're applying for. And so you have to apply the same approach of organizing your fridge. So think about what qualities are needed for this role, and what do you have in your fridge that actually helps you demonstrate those qualities. And it's also good to find those peppercorns, right? Those do add a little spark to that dish. So when you know that this is the role you want in the long term, think about those special ingredients, those peppercorns that you should try to accumulate over time. And so do work towards the peppercorns, but don't feel like what you have in your fridge is not enough. So when you're thinking about what qualities or skills are needed for your interview, typically most people want to take a chance on someone who has this fire in the belly. That was what the founder of a company described his ideal candidate as having this fire in the belly. And to him, that really meant, this hunger to do more, right? Someone who was resourceful, figured things out, had a strong work ethic, but also took initiative, that they weren't just taking orders and listening to what others were telling them to do, but they were really thinking for themselves on what else they could be doing. Someone who didn't have that arrogance, who could be mentored and taught, that was really important. Someone who really wanted to learn. And someone who wouldn't give up, that you may encounter barriers, but you're really going to be resilient and you keep trying and trying. So I want to share with you the story of how I got my job at Avid, which was probably one of the most fun, interesting, and wonderful environments that I'd worked in. It really demonstrates to you the power of these informational interviews. So I looked up what Avid Technology does, and what the company did was they built the editors, the video editors that every Hollywood movie is made on. So basically, it edits. They have the video editors, but the company also made other products that were used by all these filmmakers and broadcasters, whether it's to put movies or to create movies or to put news on air. And when I saw what they did, I decided, wow, I really want to work there. I have to work there. And so I looked up the alumni database, MIT's alumni database, and I found that the CEO of the company happened to work there. So I wrote to him and I asked him if I could just get a few moments of his time to learn a little bit more about Avid, and just, how can I can grow in my career. And I wasn't hitting him up for a job. I was really just wanting to learn more about, how can I get there? And so he took the meeting, and he was really kind and wonderful. And so, he suggested that I send him my resume, which I did. And after we talked, he said, well, there may be an opportunity. We're looking for someone with these particular skills who can speak another language, etc. And so then, he said, but it all depends on how our next quarter's results go. If we don't do well in this next quarter, then we may not be able to hire. And so, I was listening, I was waiting for news very patiently. I looked up, their quarterly results announced when they were announced, and, the company did really well. So I pinged them really quickly and said, oh, so it looks like things really went well. Would love to follow up on taking up that position that, I had talked to you about. And so, I even interviewed with people there, but then they decided not to hire after all, that they just couldn't afford to hire at that time. And so, I was really disappointed because I just really, really had decided that I wanted to work at Avid. And so, a friend of mine suggested this idea to me. I'd started interviewing elsewhere, and I had even found another job, but I still thought about Avid, and I just really wanted to work there. And so my friend suggested this idea where she said to me, listen, just send him, the CEO of FedEx. And so I sent him an overnight FedEx letter, which was really expensive to do at the time because I didn't have a job. But I sent that to him saying, I found this other job. I can go work there, but I really just want to work at Avid. And so, the FedEx arrived, and about, an hour later, I got a call from him saying, okay, so I think we'd like to make you an offer. And that's how I ended up working at Avid for 5 years. And I loved that job. And in fact, that's not where the story ends, because that was how I got the next job after Avid. So my point with the story is, I had no relevant experience at all to work at Avid. I had never been in media or broadcast or, anywhere near video editors. But it's, sometimes people are willing to take a chance on you based on your grit and just other characteristics that you do show. So one of those lessons for me was building your network. It starts with, your teachers, professors. My first job was because a professor at MIT had given me that job. And, I still keep in touch with him. So I really advise, everyone to keep building your network and keeping in touch with people. You should also, whether it's colleagues, bosses, I try to keep in touch with every boss that I've ever worked for, including even the internships that I did when I was an undergrad. So that's, 20 years ago. And, this is true for every job, no matter how small. The example I want to give you is when I, maybe about 9 years ago, there was a babysitter that I had hired, and she was just finishing high school and she was going to go to college. And she worked for me one summer, and she was the most reliable babysitter I had ever had. When I said, please be here at 8:30 in the morning, you could set your watch to when she would arrive. At 8:29, she was outside the door. And at 8:30, ding dong, she was there, and it was brilliant. It was the most stress-free summer for me as a mom, when I didn't have to worry about, when my nanny show up on time, etc. And so when she finished college and she was applying for her first job, she actually used me as a reference. And I gave her a glowing reference that she had the most amazing work ethic and the sense of responsibility that I know she would do well anywhere. And so that's my other piece of advice, that, anywhere you work, you want to get stellar recommendations, no matter, who it's from, because you never know where those people are going to end up and how they might be able to, they'll all be rooting for you, right? And so you want that. You want other people rooting for you. And then the last two things are, about LinkedIn. You should be on LinkedIn and keep, and make sure you know kind of where alumni from your school are. Find alumni from your school, do informational interviews, and that's really a great way of building that network as well. And you're building that network without looking for a job, which is much better than, when you really need a job and you're trying to find interviews. And the one other lesson I want to share is that, the example I gave you with Avid, that worked out well, right? But there are so many other examples where you end up facing rejections, and I've definitely had my fair share of those rejections, and I still get rejections today. For instance, in working on publishing my book, that's filled with rejections as well. And so there's one thing I've learned about rejections, which I learned in my late 30s, and I wish somebody had taught me this much earlier in life. I learned this because of a talk I went to by Peggy McIntosh, and if you have a chance, her talks are great. You should definitely listen to one of her talks. You could probably find them on YouTube. What Peggy says is, think of this line of social justice, and that's what she's drawn behind her in this picture. There are some things that put you above that line of social justice. They give you privilege. So for instance, when I was in that black school, I had that privilege because I had a lighter skin. When I went to a white school, I was below that social line of justice because I had a darker skin. If you're in a higher socioeconomic status, that puts you above the line. A lower socioeconomic status puts you below. If you are a minority, that puts you below. If you're, not, it puts you above, and so on. So if you take stock of some of this, you may find yourself that actually in different occasions, you may or may not have privilege, right? And what's important to realize is that you may get rejections, and some of it has to do with your privilege. And so don't internalize your rejections. What's really important is to learn from those rejections. And so, for instance, when I was starting out my companies, there were a lot of rejections from VCs, for example. And so if you look at the numbers, very few women get funded by venture capital. And so, I realized that where I fell in terms of this line of social justice meant it was very hard for me to get that VC funding. And while it's painful to go through those rejections, you just have to realize that you can learn from it and create a better pitch. And I had the most wonderful pitch in a few months because of a lot of practice and just taking in this feedback, to the point where people still, some of those investors, remember our pitch as being the best pitch ever that they've seen. But at the same time, I've learned to not internalize those rejections. There are just some rejections that you're not going to change the decision no matter how great your presentation is. And the last thing I want to share with you is about redefining success, right? I think a lot of this dilemma that we have about finding those pink peppercorns versus what's in your fridge is based on what we've come to believe is success. Success has come to become defined by the titles we hold, by the economic status we have, the car we drive, etc. And if we really disconnect from social media and just spend some time thinking, a lot of what success is about and what put us on this planet, is about that human connection. And so the real question about success is, whose life are you impacting? Maybe for you, it's your parents, it could be your family, it could be your community, it could be some of your colleagues. But success is about, whose life are you impacting and how are you impacting that life? And the example that I want to give you is someone who's truly inspirational to me, and that's a woman by the name of Kate Beatty. When I was at MIT, Kate headed up the International Students Office's host program. So meaning that she paired up students with host parents in the States. Because if you're an international student, life got very lonely around Thanksgiving, where the whole campus was deserted, but you had nowhere to go. So instead, she would pair you up with a host family here, so that you had somewhere to go for Thanksgiving. Now, Kate Beatty, when she announced that she was going to retire, the students threw her a party. And there was a hall that, they had organized this party in. And there were about 200 people who showed up of different ages from all over town. Some even, came from elsewhere. And they all came because Kate Beatty meant so much to them. She had really impacted their lives. There were all these grown men crying that Kate Beatty was retiring, She was like a mom to all of us international students. And so until she retired, you talk to any international student and everyone knew Kate Beatty. And that's truly what success means, right? If you looked at what Kate Beatty's title was, it wasn't particularly impressive, but she touched more lives than many people who had much more impressive titles. So be, like a Kate Beatty. That's kind of my role model in life, that when I grow up, I want to be like her and, live like her. And even in the 80s, she's super busy and still continues to just find ways of helping people. So the key takeaways are, every interview is about finding your narrative. Find your narrative. And that's, the most important advice that I wish I had gotten, kind of early on in my career, and something that would have been useful to me all along. And redefine success. It's really about whose lives are you making a difference in. Thank you. Ethel, over to you.
Yes, thank you for that. So I want to ask a couple of questions, and I know if anyone wants to include questions in the chat, I'm not able to, unfortunately, monitor Facebook at the moment. But yeah, feel free to respond in the chat. So if you had to go back or do you remember what your college application personal statement was like, if that's something that you want to share?
I think it had to do with grit, but I don't quite remember what it was. I think I may have, I think I just showed kind of this point about grit all the way from when I was in India to being in South Africa and having to prove myself when I had arrived at the school and had to work really hard to stay in the same grade. So that was what my story was about. But, I didn't really think about kind of the full context of it. I had picked, I think, a very narrow view of what I saw of myself and what I wanted to present.
And the reason I asked that is because I had a feeling that maybe it was about grit, because that's kind of the story that a lot of these young students keep missing, including myself, is that in the example about the peppercorn and what's in your refrigerator, and if you have experiences like taking care of a sibling, that requires a lot of grit. And the example of your babysitter, it requires a lot of time management. It requires a lot of responsibility. So what are some, having interviewed a lot of people, what are some of the common, I mean, is it grit? Is it limited to grit, responsibility, time management? And how did they sell it to you? Like, how do you know that someone's really able to exhibit those qualities in just an interview versus somebody else who maybe said it, but you knew that it wasn't really the case?
That's a really good question. I think, someone who has grit, every question that you ask them, it's not that they're trying to point it out, but it sort of really comes out in interviews. So for instance, you ask them about, something that they did. Let's say, so my field is product management. And so I asked them about some product that they built. How did you build this? And okay, so tell me an example of what went wrong. And so they might tell you, oh, this and this went wrong. And so, and they always talk about, oh, and so then we tried this, and then we tried this, And so this introspection, it's a grit. It can't just be about, I'll keep trying different things until something fits, something sticks, right? Grit also requires that you do some introspection and self-reflection. And you say, okay, well, this didn't work, and this is what I was trying to do. So what else can I do better next time? And so it's that, it's the combination of those two things where you see that people keep persevering and they try different things.
Yeah.
So in terms of interviewing advice, I think, don't just say what you did, but it's also great to share kind of a failure and what you learned from it and how you overcame that.
Precisely. And I ask that because I think it's extremely important that everyone who watches or is watching right now and eventually watches this realize that they have those qualities, as your babysitter did, as you know, anyone who does take care of a sibling or is helping out at a family restaurant or whatever the case may be. They have those. Now, how do you pitch it? And it's critical to pitch it in a way where you're not just kind of also discounting it, because I'm guilty of that. After you start recognizing, okay, these are qualities that I do possess because I've had these experiences, I still discount it in an interview. And I don't know why we do that. Do you have any insight into that? Because I definitely have discounted my level of grit, my level of task management, time and task management often in an interview.
Yeah. And, you know, it's not just you. I tend to discount a lot of these things too. You know, until I think maybe even a year ago, this thing I was saying about languages and how I discount that, anything that comes easy to you, you tend to discount. So for instance, you know, people will say, wow, you speak that many languages. And I'd always invariably say, well, yeah, but, you know, I just lived in so many places. I just kind of picked it up. And so you play down your own story. And, you know, in this world, I think there was a book that came out recently. It's titled Why Do Mediocre Men Get Leadership Positions? And, you know, while the title says mediocre men, and yes, you know, that happens often, but the point is that we value as a society narcissism or, you know, this lack of self-awareness very often in leadership. We think that this overconfidence is actually a good thing. And so, you know, given that that's kind of the environment, it's especially important that we shouldn't at least undersell ourselves. And I think that's what happens to a lot of us. We see our own hardships, we see others' hardships, and we think that you know, anyone else would have done the same thing. You know, if and that's the part that, you know, I think we really need to challenge ourselves on. It's not that everyone would have done exactly the same thing. There are different people really would have had different responses. And so it's this is where I think even creating my own narrative has required support from other people, being able to share the story with other people, and people would point out that, wow, you know, you really should talk about this. And so doing some of this practicing, even to be able to figure out who you are, is really helpful.
So with regards to, you know, being an entrepreneur and an extremely successful entrepreneur, actually, I would want to backtrack on that question a bit, because I'm not sure if everyone who is watching and will watch knows what acquisition is, and the, you know, so could you explain that just a bit, and then talk about the kinds of skills that might be that you needed to have, and then how somebody, if they want to become an entrepreneur or just create their own ideas and bring that to life, what kinds of experiences might they be able to use if they have a similar background to yours, mine, to then pitch to an investor and say, I can do this because I've had these experiences. Maybe I didn't work in this big fancy corporate world, but this is something that I definitely can do.
Yeah, so to address the first part of the question, you were saying, you know, what's an acquisition? So acquisition is when you have a company and it's bought by another company. So Hita, you were just saying, you know, that I'd started companies and yes, they were acquired by another company, for example. Your question was about then, you know, how do you pitch to investors in a way that they can see some of your qualities? I think a lot of it is shown in action, more than being able to show, more than being just saying that, you know, you have grit or have some of these qualities. It's, you know, being able to show kind of how you've made progress. Increasingly, when people invest in your company, you already have to have a product. You know, it's very, very, very rare now that anyone invests in an idea. What happens is, you know, just technology has, we've come to a point where there are so many off-the-shelf components and it's become so easy to code, etc. Everyone expects you to have a product already. It should be in the market, you should be trying it out, etc. And then they want to invest in it. It lowers the investor's risk as well. They want to know that you're actually going to be able to deliver on something, that it's not just something you're talking about, that you actually have it out. And so, figure out, this is where a lot of those qualities that I talk about, which is that fire in the belly, right? They come up, which is you have to be resourceful, figure out, how are you going to develop this idea, develop a prototype, putting it in the market, etc. And a lot of how you get something to where it is, by the time you pitch it, you've already shown some of these qualities of grit and being resourceful and being mentorable and being a quick learner, because you have to take feedback quickly and just learn from your mistakes. The one other thing I'll say about building products and being an entrepreneur, the one thing that I think overall gets emphasized by media, I call it the tech crunch syndrome, is that everyone says, look at how kind of Facebook or others have built their products. You just sort of move fast and break things. You try different things, you iterate, and then something works out. But in reality, you have to take a much more systematic approach to it. And I've made some of these mistakes as well when I've actually just iterated, because that's what everyone teaches you should be doing. And so the way to really do it systematically is have a clear vision. You should then, build a product strategy, meaning how do you translate that vision into the plan for how you're going to deliver on that vision. Then you do your execution. You don't really just execute unless you kind of know where you're going and then how you're going to get there, and then you can execute.
And I love that, because the reality is that many of these families, especially if you're a recent immigrant, or if you live in a certain area that is under-resourced, or you go to a school that's under-resourced, you don't have the room to do trial and error. So it applies also to the college process, if we do take it back to our younger audience, because they don't have the room to then apply and try one program over the summer, because that costs money. And then you can try lacrosse, for example, and then that costs money. And so really just, as you said, if they had to define themselves as the product and the vision of where that's going to go, what the strategy would look like, and what kinds of activities and experiences they already hold, and experiences they might want to continue, and then also have, would then lead to that vision. Would you agree with that?
That's brilliant. That's exactly right. And I really wish more people would think about it exactly how you said, Geeta, which is, I think we can think about everything as our product, whether it's your startup that you're trying to create, or even you can think of yourself as a product when you're planning your interview or college admissions, etc. Right? And so, what is that vision that you and those are really hard questions to answer. Like, what's your vision for yourself? I mean, even at this age, I think that's a really hard thing for me to answer. And so, which is why I view these things like inventorying your fridge as, the building blocks that help you answer those questions. And because you're exactly right, when you inventory your fridge, it helps you answer, who am I? And then that's kind of the building blocks for what am I trying to do here? And then you think about your strategy, which is, okay, so if I want to build this particular recipe, what are the ingredients that I need to have? And you're either going to go acquire them, like the pink peppercorns, or you're going to find them in the fridge.
Yeah, and it's cost effective.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most important things that we have a lot of amazing young women, and a lot of the barriers that they face is financial is a common one, regardless, even if you're immigrant first generation, or even if you're not, for many of the families that we work with. And just keeping that in mind, that not everything has to, as you mentioned, has to be trial and error. In the startup world, you don't have to constantly iterate. If you set yourself a vision, and that could be you wanting to work with, what was the company?
Avid.
You wanting to work for Avid, and that's what you did. You set that vision. You knew that you were the product, and you figured out how to meet, or what you need to do to meet that vision. And I think that's fantastic experience. It's something that nobody had told me. Same thing. My personal statement, I don't remember it and that's telling. But I do remember my graduate applications personal statements because they're more close to me. They're more relevant to what I wanted to do. And so when you do create a personal statement that is very specific to who you are, I think that most young people, even 10 years later, will start remembering their personal statements because it's a reflection of who you are.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And I don't even know. I mean, I would probably recommend this to myself, but if I were to go into an interview, and for anybody watching, if it's college or a job or whatever it may be, maybe stay off social media before going into the interview. I'd probably just do a complete ban, and say, I don't want to watch what anybody else is doing because it's all just success stories and you never know the true backstory. And focus, as you mentioned, reflect on yourself and your confidence and what you bring to the table.
Completely agree.
Thank you, everyone. This will be on our YouTube channel. And for now, thank you for learning on a Saturday, and we'll see you in June.
Thank you, everyone.